We're very excited to be at LastCon this year. Thank you for having us. Where we'll introduce the new OWASP NHI Top 10 project. We have a lot on our agenda today, but first, we already had some introductions, but we also prepared this slide, so a few words in addition. So I'm the head of research. My name is Skverer. I'm the head of research at NHI Security. As said, I have a decade of hacking in cybersecurity, everything related to from automotive to reverse engineering to web hacking. In the past 4 years within NHI Security, I spearheaded the NHI Security topic, which is kind of like an up-and-coming security topic, which includes, among other things, leading the OWASP NHI Top 10 project, we'll talk about today. Also presented my research in various other conferences, Snowfork in March, but also RSA and DEF CON. And with me, I have Tomer.
Hello everyone, my name is Yahalom. I'm a researcher at NHI Security. I help to contribute to the OWASP Top 10. I'm a Microsoft expert, Azure, NHI, sometimes to my happiness, sometimes less. And nowadays I'm researching agent security or insecurity, depending on the day. It's my first time speaking, very excited to be here.
So let's move to our agenda for today. So funnily enough, we'll start with the hardest part of the project, which is actually defining what non-human identities mean, at least for the scope of the project itself. Then we'll move to the project itself. So how does one go about creating a new OWASP Top 10 project? How does it look like? How did we create the risk? And finally, how did we rank them? Because you need a top 10 list, right? In the main part of the presentation, we'll go over the list itself. However, we won't bore you with just going over the risks and describing them. This you can read on the project page, which is available online. You'll have a QR code later. Instead, we'll talk about the subtleties and unique features of every risk, and also talk about interesting data points that supported our decision in the ranking. We'll wrap up the presentation by showing an active demonstration of an attacker breaching an organization with the goal of taking complete ownership over it. And during the attack, we'll showcase how this attacker abuses the different risks that we've talked about in the top 10 list to achieve their quest.
Of course, we couldn't ignore how much AI and AI agents in particular have changed the way the world looks like in 2025. And the connections to NHIs might be bigger than you think. So we dedicate segments of this talk to highlight these connections and show how the top 10 can also be useful for AI agent security programs. And with that, let's begin.
Okay, so indeed working on this project brought a lot of debate around the definition of non-human identities and why we define them as both secrets and credentials on one hand, and on the other hand, we're talking about things like service account and roles and auth applications. And indeed, it's a very problematic topic. So once we started, we began by trying to draft an abstract term for everything we consider a non-human identity, something that we would want to cover in our project. We ended up with this definition you can see up there: programmatic access to a process or data where a human is not required to be involved. Then we basically inspected a different object that answered to this abstract definition, which landed on both secrets and also other things. And you can see a bunch of different types of identities on the screen there. You'll see the definition in a second. And once we defined it that way, there was a notion, I thought in this case, that maybe we should derive a lot of the different concepts and risks from the human identity side of things, which is a good idea for the sake of simplicity and reusing other standards that already existed. However, it just wasn't that simple in this case.
So when dealing with human identities, well, the identities are just the humans that the users were created for. Unfortunately, with NHIs, it's a bit more complicated, since different NHIs in different environments behave extremely differently. We did have to rely on something, and so we decided that for NHIs, sometimes the credentials are the identities. Of course, this is not relevant for all environments, but again, we have to rely on specifically something. Okay, so again, there's not always one central identity behind each NHI, and let's give an example of why. For instance, you have GitHub personal access tokens. So these are tokens that a developer creates and then usually gives to a third party so that they can access GitHub on the developer's behalf. So who is the identity here? You have on one hand the user that created the token, and on the other hand the third party that's actually using it. This example is also relevant for AI scenarios where many agentic systems use personal access tokens as well, including GitHub's official MCP server implementation directs the developer to create an API, a PAT token, and then give it to the MCP server so it communicates with GitHub.
Yeah, so some audience participation. Do you also consider most of these as NHI? Raise of hands? Just me? Oh, okay. We have a few hands there. Yeah, so some of these are more likely that people will go ahead and say, yes, this is non-human identities, others not, but at least for the scope of the project, this is how we defined NHIs. Once we had this, so in the past year or so, AI agents have really changed the world and specifically how non-human identities are created and used. But what does it mean for this definition? Has it changed it at all? And how do we treat AI agents?
So AI agents have taken the world by storm, and while they didn't change the original definition of NHIs, which is processes that humans are not directly involved in, we do see a new type of agent identity that's actually using NHIs to connect to different production platforms. So for instance, you have this example where a Copilot agent might use NHIs to connect to GitHub or GCP.
Yeah, so looking at it from this perspective, it is clear that the AI agents kind of inherits the risks associated with its NHIs, right? It was given NHIs to use, so we need to treat at least the risk model of AI agents should include a risk for the NHI on top of the existing risk from it being an LLM-based application, right? With prompt injection and other different problems. So now that we established how we define the non-human entities, it's time to move to the project itself, detailing why did we decide to create it, and more importantly, why now?
So there were a few main reasons why we decided to create a project specifically for NHIs. The first is that NHIs are the connectivity enablers between different systems, agentic systems, services, and so forth. Additionally, NHI numbers are constantly on the rise since everything is connected nowadays and only getting even more connected. Finally, developers deal with NHIs not only during the development lifecycle, but during the runtime itself. This led us to believe that they deserve their own dedicated project. Attacks using NHIs don't just use exposed secrets. They use OWASP for OWASP phishing. They abuse excessive permissions. They use IAM roles in AWS, managed identities in Azure, and more. Let's take a look at a few prominent attacks that happened both this year and a couple of years ago. So first, in August 2025, we had the SalesLoft Drift attack, where attackers breached the Drift infrastructure and stole its customers' Salesforce OWASP tokens, meaning that they can just extract information from Drift's customers' environments. They use the information there to actually find more NHI credentials for different cloud environments and continue to carry out the attack in those environments. Major companies affected by this attack include Google, Palo Alto, and PagerDuty, and the list is pretty long. Another attack that happened in the same month is the NX NPM package hijack, where the attackers turned it into an info stealer, stealing not only Git config files and SSH keys, but also utilizing AI CLI-related tools for further reconnaissance.
Yeah, so, you have this fee.
Sorry. We also had a few other attacks that you probably have heard of a bit while back. So the first was that attackers brute force service accounts in Snowflake that just had weak passwords, so they were easily brute forceable. Other attacks include Okta's service account compromise. This service account had access to customer support systems and just led the attackers to attack Okta customers. And finally, there was a similar attack in Beyond Trust, where they stole an API, where an API key was compromised, and it was used again to hack into a remote customer support system. And this attack is notorious because it also affected the US Treasury itself.
Yeah, so OWASP in general has been a great tool in the past years for developers to be aware of the different risks that they face during application development. Even before we started our own project, there are plenty other top 10 projects, each focused on their own domain. And when we reviewed them, we did find some overlap. So some of them do mention authentication, credential handling, permission reduction, etc. However, we felt none of this really gave a complete overview of the risk associated with non-human identities during the development lifecycle, which makes sense because they're not dedicated to it. But then we thought we might create a project dedicated to it. And with seeing the rise of attacks, it even makes it clear that threat actors have begun focusing more specifically on non-human identities because they are more exposed, they're unmanaged, they have high permissions, they are a very good target for them to focus on. So furthermore, OWASP does a great job at pushing standardization, which is also something that we wanted to achieve using this project. And this vision really pushed us into creating this project and also collaborating with other security experts on non-human identities, security researchers from Orca, Snyk, Palo Alto, Torch, and others to create a vendor-neutral project that helps developers be aware of the different risks that they face using non-human identities. So what we did later, afterwards, so we have a raise of hands again here. Have you gotten a chance to review the OWASP Top 10 project? I'm interested. So we have one, two, a few here. Yeah, so actually we've presented a similar presentation in Snowfrock in Denver in March, just after the project was released. And by then there were basically no hands, so I'm happy to see that people are more aware. And I'm happy that you came to hear about it from us as well. So now that we understand the reason behind why we started this project, basically what we did as a team, we created about 20 different risks associated with non-human identities based on our experience. And then we had the tough job of how do we rank them.
What we did was we relied on existing OWASP risk methodology, detailing how, when an exploit is found, it should be ranked and prioritized. We took these risks into the NHI use case and came up with the following criteria. So just to quickly explain, for instance, in exploitability, 3 easy is the highest rank, and 1 hard is the lowest rank. And let's go over each criteria and explain what it means. So starting with exploitability, exploitability means that once an exploit is in place, how hard it will be for the attacker to actually, use it. 3 means that it's very easy to do so. 1 or 2 basic commands, like probably anyone can do it. While hard means that even an experienced attacker will have trouble exploiting the vulnerability. Prevalence takes into account how often this vulnerability appears in different environments. And 3 widespread means that it's very common and it will probably be multiple times in the same environment, while 1 uncommon means that it's pretty rare and doesn't show up that often. Here we relied on public reports, incident, and NHI-related reports to decide on these criteria.
Yeah, so moving to detectability, here we assume that the organization wants to tackle a specific risk or vulnerability. And then we ask the question, well, how easy it is for them to do so, assuming general tools are deployed, nothing out of the ordinary. And it's pretty self-explanatory that hard means that even if the organization would decide to tackle this problem, they would still have to do a lot of hard work to mitigate it, possibly a lot of manual work as well. Whereas easy means that existing tool can already detect this problem and also maybe fix it as well. Lastly, we have technica, or short for technical impact. So this is really depends on context, right? What's the impact that a threat actor could do by exploiting this specific risk? So what we decided to do is to focus on the average case. So analyzing, it's very difficult to know in advance, what permissions an exploited NHI might have. So for each risk, we assessed how common, what's the common non-human identity that is associated with this risk, and what permission it might have, and how much damage could be caused by someone malicious having access to it. Severe here usually means that exploiting this non-human identity probably means that you get high level of access to maybe a very sensitive service, whereas low means maybe you have limited access or maybe to a less sensitive service. So once we had this, we collected a lot of different evidence from public reports on non-human identity security, statistics. We analyzed a lot of different breaches, not just the 5 you saw, about 30 or so, and also drew from our collective experience as well as internal data to rank each criteria for each risk. We took a weighted average of all the different rankings that we got to get the final top 10 list. And with that, it's time to introduce the top 10 list. We'll start from the bottom 7.
So, as we previously said, we're not just going to explain what each risk means. You can read about the project online. We're going to demonstrate for each risk real-world occurrence of it. And by the way, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at the project, you can scan this QR code and check it out at your own leisure. Starting with number 10, human use of NHI. So how might this risk occur? Well, let's say a developer is developing some sort of automation that needs to use an API key. So the developer creates the API key, uses the key for testing, finishes creating the automation, and then he just continues to use the API key, even though he doesn't need it, and the automation is created. What are the risks here? Well, first, the API key might be over-permissive and might actually have more permissions than the developer needs. Second risk is from an other team perspective. So if you have both an automation and a human using the same credential, you won't be able to understand from the other team who is doing what, and this can create serious problems.
Moving on to number 9, we have NHI reuse. It might sound, at first glance, very similar to human use. However, it's pretty different. Let me give you an example. So let's say your team has been working on creating a new application. But it's composed of microservices. So one service might read from database, one service might do some processing and write data to somewhere, one might access the file system. And what you do as a team, you create one non-human identity, one service account, with all of those permissions, and you give it to each of those services. And in this case, you have NHI reuse in your hands, basically having single NHI provided to multiple different services. Obviously, having this risk in place usually means that you broke the principle of least privilege, right? You give more access than you should to each of those services. And it means that if the service account was ever compromised, so if one of those microservices was ever compromised, the attacker would immediately get access to all the permission that the non-human identity has.
Moving on to number 8, environment isolation. So on first hand, it might not sound very NHI related, right? Like what it even is environment isolation compared to NHI. So let me take you back to 2024. The winds are strong, and midnight blizzard hits the news. What actually happened there? Well, attackers breached one of Microsoft's test tenants, found out that that tenant in it was an OWASP app that was managed there, but actually was also installed on one of Microsoft's corporate tenants, and there it had access to read the emails of all of Microsoft's employees. This is a prime example of how not to do environment isolation. And I implore you, please use dedicated NHIs per environment. Do not mix them up.
Yeah, for number 7, we have long-lived secrets. So we see secrets created with basically no expiry or very long expiry from today pretty commonly. But why just this fact makes them so risky? Well, their longevity is actually means that they allow for prolonged and unmanaged access to whatever resource that they were configured to. And let me walk with a specific example here as well. So again, taking Microsoft here. So about 3 years ago, Microsoft AI team, they published a repository containing some material related to the work, alongside a token that they generated to allow people that want to view the models that they trained access to it. So on purpose, they published a token. This token sat in this public repository for over 2 years until researchers found it and actually found that it accidentally was granted access to the entire Azure storage account instead of just the models, exposing 38 terabytes of sensitive data, including emails and chat messages. And in this case, it was clear. So mistakes happen, right? And the fact that they gave access to the entire Azure storage account, it happens. But the main problem was that it was created with no expiry, meaning that it was valid for the entire time that it sat there. And they only intended to publish the models for a short amount of time. And if this token was created with short expiry, then the risk would be much, much lower.
Moving on to number 6, insecure cloud deployment configuration. So once again, might not sound extremely NHI related, so let's talk about it. CI/CD pipelines have become a major part of every organization, and they usually have wide access to your production environments. This means that any misconfiguration in your CI/CD pipeline can have huge impact. When comparing it with NHIs, we have two main risks that touch point between them. The first is hard-coded credentials in the pipeline, and the second is OIDC misconfigurations that allowed wider access than intention. Okay, of course, there are a lot more misconfigurations that can happen, but these are the two that are NHI related. And given a more dedicated example, so think that if you put in a wildcard in an OIDC subject, it could lead to various parties gaining unintended access to your environment.
Moving to number 5, covered half of them. So overprivileged NHI may be the first risk that comes to mind when you think about non-human identities, right? Creating a non-human identity with more permissions that it should have. And this indeed happens pretty commonly, mostly because the process of provisioning, of creating new non-human identities is basically non-existent. So in most cases, you open a ticket to someone with the right permissions to create new non-human identities, and they just do so without really fully understanding the permission that you ask for. On top of that, many platforms today just don't really allow you to create non-human identities with granular enough access that you need. So by default, they will be overprivileged. One interesting data point that I can point at here, so we relied on CSA NHI report. If you haven't read it, you should. Basically, they polled about 800 different security professionals and found that in case of overprivileged NHI, so out of all the organizations who had a security incident related to non-human identity, the fact that this non-human identity was overprivileged was the #1 reason for the incident, over 40% of cases, meaning that if it wasn't overprivileged, there will be basically no incident. So it's quite prevalent and quite dangerous.
Moving on to number 4, insecure authentication. So it's 2025, and somehow major companies such as Microsoft 365, Salesforce, Google Workspace still support the use of insecure authentication methods. Notable examples include the OWASP implicit flow, which is vulnerable to various web-based attacks, still using usernames and passwords hard-coded in scripts, but with no MFA, and using app-specific passwords, which, again, completely bypass MFA. Another major problem regarding insecure authentication is that developers are not always aware of the risks that come using these methods, and this leads to widespread use of them, and this is why it's scored such a high spot on our list.
Okay, so we finished the first 7. Are you ready to see the top 3? Woo!
So, number 3, vulnerable third-party NHI. So, supply chain attacks are not that uncommon these days, and you might have heard of some companies that were, vendors that were breached, Microsoft, Sisense, Gita, Okta, and now they tell the customers you need to rotate all credentials relating to the breached vendor. So if you are one of those unlucky customers that were affected by this, what do you actually do? Well, for starters, you need to understand that the vendor doesn't really have the capability to fully help you. They have very limited access to your environment, and so you're pretty much on your own. So what should you do? Well, you need to map all NHIs related to that vendor, a process that alone can take between days and weeks, again, depending on the size of your environment. And then you need to also rotate all of these credentials, which again can be a very serious hassle, depending on if it will interrupt with your production environments or not.
For the number 2 spot, we have secret leakage, also known as exposed secrets. So this is, I think, a very well-known problem, a huge problem, one that we didn't really have a question around whether it will be on the list. The question was just how high up, and it ended up in the 2nd place. And I think there was basically also no questions regarding exploitability and the impact of exposed secrets. Our main question was around prevalence. So how really common is secret leakage? And during an analysis of all the breaches that we looked at, it was the #1 reason for the initial access to the environment. So this is how attackers today basically get a foothold within organizations, and from there they move forward, but secret leakage is very, very huge. And it's not really surprising. According to the same CSA report that I mentioned earlier, 37% of organizations say that they still have hard-coded secrets in their code, which is a sure way to get your secrets leaked accidentally. Okay, so we're done, and there's only one left, the first place. Drum roll.
The number one spot, improper offboarding. So wait, why is improper offboarding the number one spot? Is it necessarily more risky than secret leakage or a vendor that's been compromised? Well, when the team reviewed each criteria for this risk, we found that it scored the highest rank in every single criteria. So let's break it down a bit. What is improper offboarding?
Okay, so we have to work with an example here as well. So I want you to imagine there is a non-human identity. It was created a few years ago. It was used for some important service, but since then, its owner has already left the organization. More credentials were created for these NHIs. They are thrown in various places. You don't really know where. You're not really sure what they're used for. You have an NHI in your hands, and you're not sure what to do with it, and you're really afraid to offboard it in case you break something. And this is when you have improper offboarding on your hands. So let's go through the criteria one by one from the end and explain why it got the high ranking. So starting from technical impact, here, if you remember, I talked about considering the average case scenario. And when we analyzed improper offboarding, so the question is, what are NHIs that are commonly improperly offboarded? I just alluded to it, that we found that usually the NHIs that happen to not be properly offboarded usually have the highest privileges because they were the security teams in the organization were more afraid to touch those because they're related to basically important services, which leads that the average case for improper offboarded NHIs could cause a large amount of damage, and this is why technical impact was severe. Moving to prevalence. So here we also relied on public report to understand how common improper offboarding really happens. When during analysis, we found that over half of the organizations basically have no offboarding process in place for non-human identities, and that's not surprising because today it's very hard for you to know who is the human owner of a non-human identity and properly offboard it. It's not part of the human offboarding process, and this is why so many non-human identities end up improperly offboarded.
Moving on to the detectability, so for similar reasons, detecting that you have an improperly offboarded NHI is pretty hard for two reasons. The first is, again, you don't have proper processes documenting and managing these identities. The second is that even the environments themselves, for instance, AWS roles and Google Workspace OWASP apps, it's very hard to track them and understand how many have you got and where do they connect to. Moving on to exploitability. So exploitability actually depends a bit on the circumstance. You have two main scenarios. One, that you're dealing with an ex-employee, and the other, an external attacker. So if you're talking about an ex-employee, since organizations are simply bad at properly offboarding NHIs, it's not that far-fetched that ex-employees will have access to the credentials of an improperly offboarded NHI. And since they know the environment and they have the credential, it will be very simple for them to exploit it, meaning that for them it will be easy. For an external attacker, it might be a bit more difficult, since, of course, he needs to understand that it's an improperly offboarded NHI, and he needs to gain access to its secret, so a bit tougher for him. But, of course, we'll have to take the worst-case scenario here, meaning that it's easy. And if you want to, if talking about the impact of these attacks a bit more, then you don't have distinct attacks that showcase specifically the impact of these kinds of attacks. But what you need to understand is that improper offboarding is actually the root of many of the other risks that we covered here. And if you remember, we mentioned Midnight Blizzard and the Okta attacks, they all also stemmed from improperly offboarded NHIs. When looking at millions of NHIs monitored by Aztec Security, we see that on average, 16% of NHIs that have been active for more than 2 years, that have existed for more than 2 years, have been inactive for over 1 year, as you can see here. So, of course, not all of these NHIs are improperly offboarded, but a lot of them must have been. And this showcases the huge impact and prevalence of this risk. So with a raise of hands, do you agree that this should be the #1 risk on the OWASP top 10 NHI risk?
Okay, come to us later. Tell us what the first phase should be.
Anyone needs further presentation, let us know.
Okay, so really in today's world, and I guess you guys have already been in a few talks here as well, you can't really have a presentation without talking about AI, and we did mention AI in a few places. We think it's very related to the non-human identity world. We understand, really, an AI agent is the next generation of AI, right? Putting the LLM nature of those systems to best use by providing them with access to different things. And this really changed how the world looks like for NHI security in the past year. So in May of this year, we actually worked with experts at Bayer Innovation Center to release a paper on the touch points of AI and non-human identities, basically trying to find out, listing all the different types of AI agents that you have today, where do they interact with non-human identities and what risks are associated with that. And we drew a lot of parallel lines between this and the list of the top 10, highlighting all the different risks that specific agents bring up. So let's take browser use agent as an example. So for browser use agent, you create an agent, you basically give it a browser to use with your credentials, basically your browser, and it can interact with it. And what it does, basically it combines two different risks from the top 10 list, so human use of NHI and overprivileged NHI, because first of all, when this agent interacts with your browser, does it really need, so the classic example is usually like booking flight tickets for you, right? So why does it actually need credentials for all of your different accounts across the web, right? All of your credit cards. And this leads to basically it being an overprivileged NHI. The other point is that you basically converted your user account to a type of non-human identity because now the agent is using them. So let's say someone in your organization is using browser use agent using their own identity. How can you tell who did what action, the agent or the human? So this leads to number 10.
Another example is the recent rise of MCP servers as a standard way to connect between AI agents and resource platforms. And this can showcase the connection between two different risks, the NHI 4 and NHI 2, insecure certification and secret leakage. So, but how does this work? Well, when you set up an MCP server, you have your local configuration file, and you put environment variables in it, including how it authenticates. Due to the rapid adoption of MCP, most MCP servers use coarse static credentials and do not use best practice authentication mechanisms. In fact, our research shows that over 60% of the most starred GitHub MCP servers actually use static long-lived API keys, again, while not using OWASP best standards. Another thing to note is that vulnerabilities shown in AI agents also showcase further of these risks. For example, the Copilot embedded agent in Outlook, or vulnerability, or the MCP server and GitHub MCP server implementation vulnerability, both allowed attackers to inject unsanitized data into the AI agent, poisoning its context and causing it to leak sensitive data. We believe that the cause of these types of attacks is that the agent's NHI is overprivileged, again tying to one of the risks that we already talked about. So the NHI allowed the agent both to contact and read sensitive internal data and also read unsanitized external data. And we believe that this should be split and that the NHI should enforce more granular control and either better limit what sensitive data that the agent can read, or protect it from unsanitized data.
Finally, I would like to shout out another top 10 project, a very recent top 10 project, the top 10 LLM risks. If you haven't had a chance to view their content, you should. So recently, they've started a new initiative called Agentic App Security, which is also a top 10 list they're trying to draft for agentic application in particular. And you can see on the right side here the draft. It's not a fully pledged top 10 list yet. However, there are very interesting risks up there, like tool misuse and exploitation, identity and privilege abuse, and agentic supply chain vulnerabilities, all tie very close together to the risk that we've talked about here because those agents are using non-human identities. So NHI reuse, overprivileged NHI, insecure authentication, and vulnerable third-party NHIs are all related, and we're working with this group to help build the agentic apps top 10. So with that, it's time to do some demos and see some exploits.
Yeah, so demo time. Tal will soon show you the demo, but let me spoil it a bit and give you a high-level overview of what you're going to see. So our demo starts with Alex. Alex is a former employee in a company called Skverer, and this company has access to its customers' CI/CD pipelines as a third-party vendor. One day, Alex, during some kind of incident or crisis, downloaded the credentials of one of Skverer's GCP service accounts to his machine. And when he left the company, he just stayed there because no one offboarded that NHI. Now, you can treat the scenario in two ways. It's either that Alex, as a disgruntled former ex-employee, wanted to get back at his former employer, or maybe an attacker just breached his machine and now uses the service account to continue attacking Skverer GCP environment. So let's see what the attacker can do with this service account. So typically, he can just list G-Cloud buckets, and there he will find that Skverer is storing its customers' GitHub tokens in a bucket unsecurely. So he can use this GitHub token and move the attack on to one of Skverer customers' GitHub environment. There, after some basic reconnaissance, he will find a GitHub action flow that has static, long-lived AWS credentials. He will use it, of course, to log into AWS, and will find that he's hit the jackpot and he had admin access to AWS, again, overprivileged NHI.
Okay, so yeah, let's see it in action. Let's see if the demo gods are with us today. Okay, so we have our story again begins with Alex. You can ignore my name at the top there. And we'll start by looking at the service account credentials that we have access to as the attacker. So as you can see, it exists in the directory I'm working on. As first thing we'll do is authenticate as the service account to see that the key is valid. So let's do it with everything will be done with G-Cloud CLI. So indeed, it was successful. Now we list all the different GCP projects that we have access to. As you can see, we have access to one project that is associated with Skverer. First thing, we'll set this project as an active project, and the first thing we'll do is list the buckets as like an easy way to find sensitive files or maybe credentials. Luckily for us, it will be the latter. So we'll find one bucket called customer keys. Really good. We list all the different files in this directory and see that there is customer keys in there associated with GitHub. And here I'll pause to highlight the fact that basically Skverer customers, as a CI/CD company, gave Skverer access to their GitHub accounts, organizations based on OAuth. And unfortunately for them, they had to trust Skverer security principles, which led them to put those keys in plain text in their buckets. So we'll steal one of those keys, the critical customers, I think the one I chose, and we'll list it. So we'll download it, and then we'll look at it. As you can see, this is indeed a GitHub token. You can tell by the prefix of it. Actually, this prefix actually means that this is an OAuth token provided to Skverer by this customer. So we'll go ahead and set it as an active key for GitHub and make a request to list all the repositories that we have access to. We'll do it in a second here. So as you can see, we have access to one repository. It's called internal repository. It is internal. In fact, it's not public, but we only have read access to it. So we can't really affect anything, but we can search for exposed secrets. And the best case to do it, the best place to do it is in CI/CD pipelines, including GitHub Actions. So we'll go ahead and list the workflows directory in this repository. And we'll find, in a second, we'll find there is one GitHub action named AWS deploy, and hopefully it will contain secrets. You already know because you were spoiled. But we'll go ahead and download this workflow here to look at it. So indeed, it's a GitHub Actions file, a YAML file containing the action itself, including the hard-coded AWS keys in there. It's unfortunately more common than you think, especially in private repositories where people say, oh, this is not so bad because no one can see it. Well, unfortunately for the critical customers, we can, and we'll go ahead and finally use the AWS CLI tool to configure these keys. So we'll do it in a second, and use the infamous getCallerIdentity API request in AWS to see if these are valid credentials and who we are. As you can see, we are some service account in some AWS account. So we list our policies to view what permissions we have. And good for us, we have administrator access. So that's the demo. Moving forward. Oh. OK. So to tie this presentation up, we're not here to just surface risks and talk about issues and tell you that everything is bad. We really wanted to help developers, educate developers, and help them mitigate those risks that we've talked about. So each page, dedicated to each risk in the project, will have a whole section dedicated to what you can do to remediate this risk and how could you as a security professional or your organization, what steps can be taken to mitigate it. So we'll not focus on this right here. We just take the specific problems that you've just seen in the demo and talk about how they could be remediated. So starting off, the entire thing, if you remember, started from an ex-employee having still access to one of the GCP service accounts of Skverer CD, which is the improperly offboarded NHI problem. So how can you solve this? Basically, we have just one mitigation for it is to create a process, but you can start small. I think the best thing to start with when you design an offboarding process is ownership. If starting today, every time someone creates an NHI, maybe you use a ticketing system nowadays for your DevOps team to do it. So every time this happens, something somewhere gets recorded that this person is now the owner of this NHI that was created, and insert this piece of information into the offboarding process of this person, of this human. So once this owner has left the organization or maybe moved department, one of the steps would be to go over all the NHIs associated with that person and decide whether to decommission them because they're not needed anymore, or maybe transfer the ownership to a new human. That way you never lose track of who's the owner of this NHI and you can more easily offboard them.
When it comes to third-party NHIs, you typically have limited control over them. But what you can do is use any tool in your disposal to create a proper inventory of them and monitor their accesses. So again, in a sentence, create an inventory of all of your third-party NHIs.
Right, and finally, we had hard-coded credentials in CI/CD tool. In this case, it was in GitHub Actions. So nowadays, every CI/CD tool that I know of supports OIDC-based authentication, and also all the cloud and services themselves offer OIDC-based OIDC-based identities natively. So we use this. I implore you to transfer all hard-coded credentials being used for authentication to a credential-less approach based on OIDC. It basically eliminates the possibility that someone will just see your CI/CD pipeline and steal the tokens from there. With that, we've done presenting to you the OWASP top 10 NHIs. Thank you so much for coming. We'll be available here to chat about this project. We're also very welcoming any contributions. If you're interested, also approach us. We're ramping up for 2026. We'll redo this and draft the risks again and the ranking, and now with AI agents in mind. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to call. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
How much time do we have? We have 5 minutes for questions if anyone has anything. Yeah?
You asked earlier whether what you selected for number one should be the number one. I think your summation actually addressed what number one should be.
Yeah.
It's not the offboarding, it's governance. Incomplete or missing governance, that should be your number one. Because that's what you're talking about here, is having some governance, other than the last piece of it, have some governance standards and frameworks.
Yeah, I think
is a sub
yeah, we decided to focus on the sub aspect of governance because when you're talking about risk, I think you don't want it to be too large, right? Because then people are looking at it and I'm not sure how to handle it. But yeah, drafting the risks themselves and like making sure they are not too big or too small was very tough. But in the next iteration, we're more than welcoming contributions regarding this. Yeah. Yeah.
I know you mentioned that there is some documentation which will correlate the NHI and the agent security requirements that came out, but at a very high level, I was wondering, like, is the concept of agent name service in the agent security requirements, but like when you create identities, especially I'm thinking of like say the AI agents, how are we like creating some like repositories for like these specific identities? The OWASP agent talks about agent naming service, but is that documentation going to sort of correlate that?
Yeah, so actually I'm not familiar with the name server. I think that protocols like A2A try to do something similar to namespacing, but that's a very good question at how.
I think they're basically trying to create like, you know how you have the MCP servers where you can define the policies and rules for tool access. They're asking to create agent repos, which will define all of the agents in your enterprise, and you can create, you know, more IDs for what LLMs they use.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. That way you can also build security on top of this, because now you can identify all different agent identities that exist in your server, and possibly if you add more things on top of this, monitor them for activity. Maybe you have.
If you have an agent name that's defining that, this NHI should closely be the same. You know.
What do you think?
I think it really depends on the agent type. Like when you're building your own agents, so of course you have more control over the identities that you're creating. Of course, as you've seen, even without agents, people are still using non-practice identities. So I think there's a huge risk of it, like spilling to agent identities, even when you create them. But there's a large risk in using like agent platforms. Okay, so for instance, Microsoft Copilot, or like various other vendors like Salesforce, you don't have complete control over the identity. And a lot of times they like force you to use a specific identity type. Okay, so Agentforce agents might just use users, or Copilot agents could use like these hidden first-party OAuth apps. So the question is, what do you do there? Because you can't, fully control it. So you should monitor it and be aware of it and understand what the permissions they have, even if you can't limit them.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think we're up on time. Because it's okay.
That's enough.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming.